For 3 days, Sarah Thompson felt an unsettling unease in her own home. It started on a Wednesday morning when she noticed a large shadow lurking near her front porch. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps a figment of her imagination. But as she approached the window, her breath caught in her throat. A lion. She blinked, unsure if what she was seeing was real. There in the yard, a massive lion sat calmly under the shade of a tree. Its golden mane rippled in the wind, and its eyes, unblinking, watched her house with an almost unnatural stillness. Sarah stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. She had never seen this lion before. She didn't live anywhere near a zoo, and lions were not something you just came across in suburban neighborhoods. Was it lost? Was it dangerous? Should she call animal control? But the lion didn't seem threatening. It didn't growl or pace, it simply sat there, as though it had made her lawn its home. The next day, when Sarah looked out again, the lion was still there, and the day after that, it remained. It didn't leave. It didn't make a sound, it just watched. A week passed. Sarah couldn't bring herself to open the door, even though she had been spending hours just staring at the lion through the window. Something about it felt familiar, as if it were waiting for something. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random encounter, and the longer the lion stayed, the more she was certain something significant was about to unfold. One evening, as the sun began to set, the lion stood up and slowly walked toward the front door. Sarah's heart raced. Was it time to call for help? She took a deep breath and slowly moved to the door, her hand hovering over the knob. As the lion came to a stop right outside, it sat facing her house. It was waiting. Sarah stood frozen in front of the door. The lion, now sitting just a few feet away, its amber eyes locked on hers. The evening sun cast long shadows across her porch, the air thick with tension. She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. What was she supposed to do? Call animal control? The police? But something in the back of her mind told her that wasn't the right move. As she hesitated, the lion didn't move, didn't growl. It just stared at her with an intensity that felt almost familiar. It was as though it was waiting for her to do something. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. With a deep breath, Sarah made up her mind. She was going to open the door. Her hand gripped the doorknob, the cool metal sending a shiver down her spine. She turned it slowly and stepped out onto the porch, her eyes never leaving the lion. It didn't flinch. It didn't move closer. It just remained there, watching her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she took a cautious step forward. The lion stayed seated, its gaze unwavering. There was no sign of aggression, no growl, just a calm presence that seemed almost comforting. It wasn't what she had expected at all. The lion blinked slowly, as if acknowledging her. Sarah knelt down to make herself less intimidating, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "What are you doing here?" The lion didn't answer, of course, but in that moment Sarah could have sworn it was trying to communicate something. It didn't feel like an animal looking for food or shelter. It felt more like a companion. Just as she was about to take another step, the lion moved slowly, deliberately toward her. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. But the lion didn't approach aggressively. Instead, it simply came close enough to nuzzle her hand, brushing its warm, rough fur against her fingers. A shock of recognition hit her. She had felt this before. Tears pricked her eyes as she slowly began to understand. The lion wasn't just some wild animal. It was here for her, and in that quiet moment, standing there on her front porch, Sarah's heart filled with an overwhelming sense of understanding. This wasn't random. This lion, this creature, had come into her life for a reason. As Sarah stood there, her hand gently resting on the lion's massive head, a flood of memories suddenly rushed back. The warmth of the lion's fur seemed to trigger something deep within her, something she couldn't explain. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push aside the thoughts that were racing through her mind. The lion's steady gaze was comforting, almost familiar. It was as if they had shared a bond long before this moment. The lion nuzzled her hand again, and as she looked down into its amber eyes, something clicked. This wasn't the first time they had met. Her breath caught in her throat. This lion, it couldn't be. It had been years since she had seen that face, that same powerful, knowing expression. She had almost forgotten, buried it deep within her. The memory resurfaced clearer now. It was the same lion from the jungle safari she had gone on with her family years ago. Back then, she had been a young woman just starting her career, traveling to remote areas for work. One day during a tour of the jungle, she had gotten separated from her group. In a panic, she had wandered deeper into the forest, lost and disoriented. That's when she encountered him, the same lion. It had emerged from the trees, towering over her, its golden mane shining in the sunlight. At first, Sarah had been frozen in fear, but the lion hadn't attacked. Instead, it had watched her carefully, studying her with those intense, wise eyes. Then, almost as if sensing her distress, it had led her back to her group. Sarah had always wondered how that lion knew exactly where to take her, how it had been able to guide her when there was no clear path. But now, standing on her porch with the same lion nuzzling her hand, the connection was undeniable. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, You saved me that day." The lion didn't respond, of course, but its eyes softened. It seemed to acknowledge her words, understanding. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just an animal seeking food or shelter. This lion had come back into her life for a reason, and it wasn't about being lost or in danger anymore. It was about something deeper. The lion stood still, staring at her, and for a moment time seemed to slow. Sarah felt as though the universe had aligned to bring them together again. This was no random encounter. This lion who had once guided her to safety was now here for her again, in her own home. Suddenly she understood. This lion hadn't just saved her life that day. It had been watching over her all these years, and now it was here to protect her once again. As Sarah stood there, her hand still resting on the lion's warm, rough fur, a wave of emotion surged through her. The lion's eyes held a depth of understanding that left her breathless. It wasn't just a wild animal. It was something more. She had felt this before, but now it was becoming clearer. A long-buried memory from her childhood began to surface, one she hadn't thought about in years. She slowly stepped back, her heart racing as the lion remained calm, its gaze never leaving her. The lion's presence felt comforting, like an old friend returning after a long time apart. Suddenly, the realization hit her like a thunderclap. This lion wasn't a stranger. It was familiar, too familiar. A memory came flooding back. When Sarah was a little girl, she had spent several summers at her grandparents' house deep in the countryside. She remembered playing in the vast open fields, running through the grass with her cousins. But most of all, she remembered the day she had met a lion. It was a rescue, she now recalled. A lion that had been raised and protected by her grandfather. The lion had been a part of their lives, their family, before being taken to a sanctuary. Sarah's grandfather had always spoken of the lion as if it were a member of the family, a bond forged through years of trust and understanding. Her grandfather had passed away many years ago, but Sarah couldn't help but feel that this was somehow connected. The lion in front of her now was the same one from her childhood. She had never forgotten the way it had looked at her with such knowing eyes. With trembling hands, Sarah reached out again, and the lion, understanding her hesitation, lowered its head, allowing her to gently touch its mane. The connection was undeniable. The lion had returned, and it had come to her for a reason. A rush of tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "It's you, isn't it? It's really you." The lion let out a soft growl, almost as if in acknowledgement, then turned its head toward the house as though signaling for her to follow. Sarah stood frozen, unsure of what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. The lion had come for a reason, and it was time for her to understand why. As Sarah stood on the porch, the lion's amber eyes locked onto hers, silently urging her to follow. There was a quiet, undeniable pull in its gaze, as though it knew something she didn't, something she needed to understand. The lion took a step back, and then another, waiting for her to move. With every step it took, Sarah felt a sense of urgency inside her, like the lion was leading her to something important, something that had been waiting for a long time. Reluctantly, Sarah followed. The lion moved with slow, deliberate steps, its large, powerful frame making no sound on the porch as it crossed into the yard. Sarah kept a few paces behind, her mind racing. What did it want? Why had it returned? After all these years? The lion led her around the back of the house, through the garden where she used to play as a child. The air felt different, charged with an unexplainable energy. As they reached the far end of the yard, the lion stopped in front of a large oak tree, its branches sprawling high above them. Sarah felt a strange sense of recognition. She had spent so many childhood days playing around this very tree, but today it felt like a different place altogether. The lion turned to face her, and as it did, Sarah noticed something strange at the base of the tree. There, hidden beneath a cluster of thick roots, was a small, weathered box. Her heart skipped a beat. What was this? Why hadn't she seen it before? The lion seemed to nudge the box gently with its nose, then stepped aside as if granting her permission to open it. Her hand shook as she crouched down, reaching for the box. The wood was old and rough, its surface covered in dust. She opened it slowly, her breath catching in her throat as the lid creaked. Inside the box, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a small, intricate medallion. As Sarah picked it up, memories flooded back. Memories of her grandfather, of the lion, of the stories he had told her as a child. He had spoken of a medallion, something that had been passed down through generations, a symbol of protection and loyalty. But why had the lion brought it to her now? As if answering her unspoken question, the lion approached her once again, sitting down by her side. Its eyes were filled with an understanding, a calm certainty. Sarah looked down at the medallion in her hand, realizing with a shiver that this was the key. The lion hadn't just come back to her. It had come back because she had inherited a responsibility, a role her grandfather had once held. The medallion wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a token of guardianship, meant for someone who would protect the land, the animals, and the legacy her grandfather had left behind. The lion had come to pass this duty on to her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she held the medallion, the weight of it settling in her hands. The lion, sensing her emotions, nuzzled her once more, a reassuring, comforting gesture. In that moment, Sarah understood. The lion had been waiting for her to be ready, to understand her true purpose, and now she was ready. The weight of the medallion in Sarah's hand felt heavier than it ever had before. As she stared at it, a flood of emotions rushed through her. This small, intricate piece of metal was more than just a family heirloom. It was a symbol of a duty she had never known she would inherit. The lion's presence beside her reminded her that she wasn't alone in this. It had come back for a reason, and that reason was her. With a deep breath, Sarah looked down at the lion. Its golden eyes met hers, filled with understanding and trust. There was no fear, no doubt. The lion was patient, knowing that Sarah needed time to fully grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. But there was no turning back now. Sarah stood slowly, her hands still clutching the medallion, and as she looked around the yard, everything seemed to fall into place. The bond between her family, the land, the lion stretched back generations, something her grandfather had always known but never fully explained. Now it was her turn to carry that legacy. She turned to the lion, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. "I understand now," she whispered. "I'm meant to protect this land, this legacy, but how?" The lion stepped forward, its massive head lowering slightly, as if giving its approval. It nudged the medallion gently with its nose, guiding her hand back to her chest. In that moment, Sarah knew the lion wasn't just a guardian. It was her guide. It was here to help her navigate the path ahead. The truth settled in her heart. Her grandfather had known this day would come. He had passed the torch to her, trusting that she would be ready. The lion's return wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of something much larger, something ancient and sacred. As Sarah stood there, her heart filled with resolve, she looked down at the medallion and made a silent promise. She would honor this responsibility. She would protect the land, the animals, and the legacy that had been entrusted to her. The lion stood by her side, its golden mane gleaming in the soft light of the setting sun. It wasn't just a wild animal. It was her partner in this new journey. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The world seemed to pause for a moment as Sarah took her first steps forward with the lion by her side. She knew she was ready for whatever lay ahead, and with the medallion resting on her chest, she would never be alone.